Tonight, we delve into the dark, dangerous, and far less glamorous reality of medieval assassins, shadowy figures who slip through castle corridors and back alleys to alter history with a blade and a whisper. While modern films make them look slick and heroic, the reality was harsh and miserable. Before settling in, make sure to like and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy this content. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and the current time. It's always interesting to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for some ambient background noise, and let's step into tonight's tale. Let's be honest, no one in the Middle Ages ever dreamed of stabbing a noble in the neck for a handful of silver and the privilege of hiding in a barrel for days. Becoming an assassin wasn't an ambition. It was rock bottom, the job people took when their lives had completely fallen apart. These weren't elite warriors from mountaintop temples. They were desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, and ex-thieves with good aim. People so far outside society's radar they could kill someone and still not show up in records. If you had anything to your name, land, title, even a goat, you didn't become an assassin, you hired one. But if you just escaped prison, had a reputation for handling problems, and could slip through a tavern unnoticed, someone was likely to slide a coin pouch across a table and murmur a name. And that name was never an easy one. It wasn't Bob the quiet turnip farmer. It was always powerful, rich, and heavily guarded. The money was tempting. The job, terrifying. But anyone even considering it had usually lost everything: family, future, even teeth. And forget about benefits. No pension, no fame, no evenings off. You couldn't exactly advertise your services either. You had to stay silent, act fast, and never admit what you did, especially not after a few drinks at the local inn. No one chose to be an assassin. They got there because life beat them down and left them with nothing but a hood and a worn-out dagger. They weren't heroes, not even villains, just the shadows that made everyone uneasy, and most didn't live long enough to spend their silver. Let's kill the first myth. There was no secret monastery training under candlelight with wise old masters and emotional flute solos. No montages, no guidance, no speeches. If you learned anything, it was by surviving your first few attempts. Most assassins weren't trained. They were just desperate, reckless, and had run out of options. They were desperate amateurs, not elite killers. Just people with a decent sense of direction and the ability to climb without making noise. If you had a military background, great, you knew how to hold a knife. If not, stabbing was easy enough to figure out, but getting away afterward with all your organs still in place? That took either real skill or pure luck. Usually luck. There were no manuals, no welcome briefings, no guild meetups. No one taught you how to check for decoys or find a noble's bedroom. You learned those things hanging off a ledge, hoping you didn't just sneak into the laundry room again. Poison? That was trial and error, heavy on the error. Sometimes it worked. Other times the target just got a headache, or you poisoned yourself. No poison hotline, just hope and questionable herbs. If you were absurdly lucky, maybe a thief or mercenary showed you a trick or two. If an older assassin mentored you, it didn't last. Assassins didn't retire, they vanished. Training with weapons? Forget it. You weren't carrying a sword. Maybe you had a stolen dagger, a garrote if you were fancy, and anything else you could hide under your cloak without making noise. You weren't a martial arts master. You were a guy with scars, silent steps, and a tendency to hang around alleyways. You learned by surviving, killing fast and messy, then disappearing before anyone could put your face on a wanted poster. Your education came with no certificates, just bruises, bloodstains, and the growing understanding that you were completely on your own. Why become an assassin in the first place? Coin. Shiny, heavy, tempting coin. That promise lured you in, but the reality? Lies. People who hire assassins don't want a long-term commitment. They want a one-time job, and definitely no loose ends. They promise silver, half now, half later, if they were generous. But later often meant after we know you didn't screw it up, attract attention, or live long enough to talk. So you'd pull off the job, sneak in, stab someone powerful, flee, and when you came back, surprise, the client's gone, or worse, waiting to stab you instead. Killing you was cheaper than paying you, And even if you did get paid, it was never enough. Not for the danger, the blood, or the 3 days spent hiding in a haystack full of fleas and existential crisis. You might get a few coins and a cold thanks, if that. Sometimes the job wasn't even real. It was a trap, designed to lure you into a sting. You'd be told to kill someone, only to find guards waiting. And no, you couldn't take it to court. Try suing a noble for unpaid murder fees. The only court you'd see was the one stringing you up. So you learned. Get paid up front. Trust nobody. Not the client, not the messenger, not the smiling idiot who said this would change your life. Because it did, by shortening it. Being an assassin meant living off broken deals and disappearing before they broke you too. Let's talk about gear. Fantasy stories and stealth games lied. There were no fancy wrist blades, no magical daggers, no smoke bombs. You worked with what you could steal, sharpen, or hide under rags. If the stars aligned, maybe you had a decent dagger. Nothing flashy, just sharp, rust-free, and not stained with your last target's insides. Poison existed, sure, but it was unreliable, made from plants, minerals, or sometimes frog guts. Some killed fast, some slow, just made people puke for hours and recover angry as hell. Rope? Occasionally useful. You could choke someone, climb something, or tie something down with it, but it wasn't glamorous either. You'd better know how to use it quickly, because nothing ruins an assassination like fumbling with a knot while whispering, "Wait, does this loop go under?" Bows? Effective. If you had one, knew how to shoot it, and weren't trying to sneak it into a palace disguised as a florist. Most assassinations weren't sniper missions. They were close-up, personal, fast, and as quiet as possible. Ideally not so messy that you'd slip off work, and you didn't get backups. If your blade bent, broke, or fell down a well, you improvised. Slate roof tile? Maybe. Rusty nail? Worth a shot. Shoe buckle with conviction? Why not? You hid your gear in hems, boots, or even baked into hollowed-out bread. And you kept it close, not for convenience, but because in this line of work, your weapon was your best friend, your manager, and your retirement plan. No gear upgrades, no tuning up between jobs, no maintenance montages. You just hoped your stuff didn't fail you in the moment of truth, because in the end, it wasn't the weapon that did the killing. It was you, under-equipped, underpaid, and expected to pull off a miracle with whatever sharp object you had and a prayer. You weren't hired to deal with random drunkards in alleyways. No one paid you to gut Jeff the sleepy candlemaker. Your contracts were for nobles, bishops, high-ranking officers, even royalty. And those people, they were incredibly hard to kill. First, there were the guards. Not just a couple, dozens. Armed, armored, and suspicious. Some stood at the gates, some patrolled hallways, others loomed around just to stare you down. You had to memorize their schedules, the creaky floorboards, and exactly when the one with asthma had to pause on the stairs. Second, there were the walls. Castles didn't come with welcome mats. They had drawbridges, murder holes, and moats filled with bitey things. Even if you didn't fall in, you had to dodge arrows and avoid getting cooked by boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil. Your job description casually included, maybe flambéed for peeking. Then there were the staff. Cooks, scribes, stable boys. One raised eyebrow, and they'd be running to the guard faster than you could mutter, "I'm just the herbalist." You weren't just fighting swords. You were fighting medieval gossip. And gossip, when it came with survival, traveled faster than anything else in the Middle Ages. Finally, there was the target. Paranoid? Absolutely. Surrounded by traitorous relatives and fake friends. They didn't eat unless someone tasted the food first. They didn't sleep without 3 locks on the door, and sometimes not even the same bed 2 nights in a row. It was like a deadly version of musical chairs. And don't get excited when you hear they're going to a feast. Sure, they'll be drunk, but so will you. And you'll still have to sneak past elite guards, a pack of dogs, a hyper-alert jester, and 50 drunk guests with sharp cutlery. Even getting close could take weeks, posing as staff, bribing maids, hiding in barrels. And when the moment finally came, you got one chance. One clean, perfect, silent, blood-minimizing strike. Or you'd be the next guy hanging outside the gate with a wooden sign that said, "Nice try." When you imagine a medieval assassin, you probably picture sleek robes, leather bracers, and a hood catching the moonlight. The reality? You looked like a sickly goat herder with secrets. Disguises back then weren't stylish or efficient. You used whatever scraps you could find: peasant rags, oversized monk robes, or a stinky guard uniform that still carried the scent of its last owner. Blending in meant looking just as ragged, injured, and malnourished as everyone else. You didn't seem suspicious because of your outfit, but because you kept adjusting your belt to hide a dagger wrapped in old cloth. Masks weren't a thing. Covering your face made people assume you had the plague, which was great for being left alone, but terrible for sneaking into social events. If questioned, you had to improvise fast. "I'm Brother Tobias, rooftop prayer specialist." Even if you slipped past the guards, noble households were full of sharp-eyed staff. Servants noticed strange faces, especially ones who didn't know which cat belonged to the cook. One awkward interaction, and you were one candle holder away from a concussion. If your disguise worked, congrats. You now had to maintain it for hours while pretending not to notice all the tempting targets walking by. There were no wigs to help you age up or down. You'd smear dirt on your face and hope no one got close enough to realize your beard was glued on with honey. Your disguise didn't protect you. It bought you 5 minutes, maybe. After that, you either vanished or played your role flawlessly. If anyone saw through it, well, no one wanted to be caught holding a sword in the bishop's laundry room, especially while dressed as a nun on a holy day. Medieval assassins didn't have teams, no crossbow-wielding sidekicks, no potion-brewing alchemists, no friendly handlers giving pep talks. You had yourself, a rusty blade, and trust issues. There were no real assassin guilds, just drunken gossip at taverns. You didn't meet other assassins, you avoided them. In your line of work, staying anonymous meant staying alive. Every contact was a risk, every name a possible betrayal. Even your client might not know who you really were, and if they did, you were already thinking about your escape plan. Friendship was out of the question. Friends asked questions. Lovers noticed blood, scars, and why you sleep with a dagger under your pillow. You couldn't stay in one place too long. One person recognizing you at the market could send you running for the sewer. Even criminals steered clear. Thieves liked company. You? You were the guy who made people vanish. People either feared you or saw you as a magnet for angry mobs. And you couldn't talk about your struggles. Nobody wanted to hear about the emotional toll of choking a corrupt bishop in silence. At inns, you sat in the darkest corner, back to the wall, always watching the door. You never got drunk. You never stayed 2 nights. If someone asked your name, they had to pay first, and even then, it wasn't your real one. Being a medieval assassin meant mastering the art of disappearing, not just in crowds, but from the lives you never got to live. Let's say you took the job. You plotted the route, bribed the right people, disguised yourself as a chimney sweep, and then you froze. Maybe your target turned around unexpectedly. Maybe their child was with them. Maybe your hand shook like a leaf at the worst moment. Now you're dead. Failure wasn't a warning or a second chance. It was a public, horrifying, and theatrical death. Think ropes, fire, spiked wheels, and devices with names like the Bone Cracker's Delight. If you missed the kill, the whole job collapsed. Your target lived and alerted everyone. Suddenly, you weren't a shadow anymore. You were a wanted man with a face drawn on every tavern wall within 30 miles. And if that didn't get you, your client might. A failed assassin wasn't just a disappointment. They were a threat. Someone who could talk under torture or spill secrets. Your employer would likely be the first to put another killer on your trail. There were no retries. No oops slipped, let me try again tomorrow. You had one shot, one perfect, clean strike, or you'd end up swinging outside the city gates. Time was never on your side. If you messed up, your best hope was to die quickly, before anyone could torture your identity out of you. Failure didn't just mean death, it meant humiliation. You hadn't just missed a kill, you failed to stay unseen, to be flawless. And in the assassin's world, anything short of perfection might as well be painting a bullseye on your back. No one cared how many perfect jobs you pulled off before. The only thing that mattered was the last one. If you botched that, you'd better start running. But let's say it worked. The dagger hit its mark, silent, clean. Your target dropped with no alarm, no guards, no struggle, just a corpse where a powerful person used to stand. Congratulations, now run. Because being a successful assassin didn't mean sipping wine while chaos bloomed behind you. It meant sprinting down dark alleys with blood on your boots and dogs already tracking your scent. There was no moment to savor the kill, no time to reflect, no drink, no debrief, no thank you, just panic and pursuit. The second the blade hit flesh, your new mission began. Escape. You needed an exit plan in place before the kill ever happened. Routes, disguises, a safe house or two, maybe a boatman who didn't ask questions. Because the city would be in lockdown within minutes. The gates slammed shut, soldiers everywhere, and your rough sketch would be posted on every wall with the words, armed and extremely stabby. And your client? They weren't waiting at some inn to pay you with a smile. No, they were already gone. Because a successful assassin is a liability. You've proven you can get into impossible places and kill untouchable people. Even when you got paid, you left with a target on your back. A week of sleeping in barns, bribing strangers, shaving your beard in candlelight, and calling yourself Brother Lucian as you tried to blend in with a group of monks heading east. Success didn't mean you were safe. It just reset the game with even more people hunting you. So yes, you got the kill. But now, run for your life. As if that wasn't bad enough, being a medieval assassin came with another delightful challenge. Paranoia. Not yours. Everyone else's. You weren't just feared. You were considered cursed, unnatural. To the average person, you weren't a human with a knife. You were some dark force whispering to devils and smearing frog guts under the moonlight. Why else could you disappear like that? Logic didn't stand a chance. But superstition? That ruled everything. Some people believed assassins could shapeshift. Others swore you were invisible unless doused in holy water. One rumor claimed you made deals with forest spirits and could kill people just by breathing near their walls. You'd walk through a village and mothers would whisper to their children, "Don't look him in the eye, he'll hex the baby." Your weapons? Tainted. Daggers were said to be forged in cursed fires. Poison? That wasn't science. That was witchcraft. And chances are you stirred that poison with a severed toe under a blood moon, or so the rumors went. You'd think fear would work in your favor. People should stay away, right? But in truth, fear made things worse. Superstitious mobs don't ask questions. They act. They throw rocks, light torches, and yell, "Burn him before he summons lightning." Your reputation didn't protect you. It turned everyone against you. If someone in the village died unexpectedly, an illness, a fall, choking on a chicken bone, someone would whisper, "Maybe it was the shadow man, maybe it was him." Just being nearby when something went wrong was enough to get hunted. So you kept moving, always. Stay too long and a priest would ring the bell, and half the town would show up with pitchforks like they'd been waiting for a reason. And heaven help you if they found anything odd on you, some dried herbs, a strange coin, or even just an unfamiliar accent. That was all it took. Someone would scream "sorcerer," and suddenly you were tied to a stake. In a world where monsters wore human faces, being quiet, clever, or quick made you dangerous. And dangerous things, those were burned. Now let's talk about poison, the so-called elegant weapon of the assassin. A silent death, no blood, no screaming, just a sip, a stagger, a sigh, in theory. In practice, poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to win a sword fight using a daisy and good intentions. First off, poisons weren't reliable. You didn't have lab-grade cyanide or neat capsules labeled certain death. You had plants, roots, mushrooms, some crushed minerals, and if you were feeling particularly ambitious, maybe some toad guts. You had to gather, mix, and hope. And even then, there was no guarantee. There were no measuring tools. You guessed. Too little, and your target just felt sick and left the party early. Too much, and you keeled over while seasoning the stew. And kitchens? They were chaotic. You couldn't exactly stroll in and drop hemlock in the soup pot. You had to bribe a cook, sneak in unnoticed, or worse, try to lace a dish that would be tasted by 3 people and a dog before the noble ever saw it. Yes, a dog. Nobles didn't just eat meals. They launched security operations. Food was tasted, blessed, sniffed, and scrutinized by a chain of staff before it reached their fork. Some even had food tasters for the food tasters. Assuming you did it Managed to poison the dish without detection, and the target actually ate it? Congratulations. Now wait, because some poisons worked in minutes, others took days. One moment the Duke's laughing at a joke, the next he's turning blue and demanding to see his astrologer. And if he survived, he wouldn't blame the chef. He wouldn't blame the taster. He'd blame you, the quiet stranger with herbal knowledge and a suspicious squint. So poison? Not exactly efficient. It was messy, risky, and full of variables. And if you got caught, oh, there were no quick deaths. You were interrogated until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the Duke to the guard dog. Even if you'd only ever brewed tea, and you'd think, after pulling off something so high stakes, removing a tyrant, unraveling a bloodline, silencing a political rival, you'd be celebrated or rewarded. But the reality? That's a whole other nightmare. Threat. Someone would remember your name? Not a chance. You were an assassin. Your name was never meant to be remembered. At best, you were a whisper, a rumor. A foreigner with cold eyes, a quiet man who never finished his drink. You might have carried out the most legendary hit in decades, but your legacy would be just a mysterious footnote in some dusty ledger. That was the whole idea. Clients didn't want stories. They wanted silence. The fewer who knew who did the job, the safer everyone was, and the less chance they had of being poisoned themselves by the same blade they hired. So the moment the job was done, your name, if it was even real, was buried. No signatures, no trophies, no monologues, just silence. And if someone did know your name, that was a loose end. And loose ends didn't live long. Forget honor. There were no medals for staying silent, no statues for stopping a war with one dagger in the dark. Nobles got monuments. You got a wooden box or a spike with a sign reading traitor. At best, your name became a curse, a story told to scare nobles. Don't cross the crown, remember Lord Ulrich. But as for the man who made Ulrich vanish, gone, forgotten. That was the job. Not fame, not fear, just absence. Because the moment you became known, you became a target. Heroes got remembered, assassins got erased. So you lived, you finished the job. You even got paid. Miraculous. Now all you had to do was lay low and trust your client would keep your secret. Wrong. In the world of medieval assassins, rule number 1, never trust anyone, especially the person who hired you. Nobles, merchants, bishops, they didn't respect you. They needed something dirty done, and you were the sharpest tool in the shadows. But once it was over, you became dangerous. You knew too much. Who ordered the kill? Why? How much they paid? That made you a liability. So they vanished, ghosted you, claimed they never met you, or worse, sent someone to tie up the contract with something sharper than words. Sometimes they even hired another assassin to kill you right after the job. No refunds, just less risk. And if you tried to get clever, blackmail, threaten, demand more, congrats. That was your final mistake. Medieval power didn't bargain with assassins, it crushed them. Even if a client had honor, and that was rare, you still had to assume they were watching, like waiting, already sharpening a blade. Because to them, you were a secret that couldn't speak, a shadow that couldn't linger. Success didn't earn you safety, it earned you suspicion. If you could kill once, you could do it again, and no one wanted to be next. But let's say somehow you beat the odds. You survived. The kills, the betrayals, the near misses, you outlived your targets, your clients, even your conscience. Now what? Retirement? Not a chance. Medieval assassins didn't get pensions. No cozy cottages, no farewell speeches, no grateful kings handing out gold and titles. You didn't get to grow old. You disappeared or you died. The reason was simple. You were never safe. Not even when the job was done. You carried too many secrets, remembered too many names, spilled too much blood. People didn't want you retired. They wanted you gone, buried, forgotten. And even if no one came after you, and that was a huge if, you lived with the fear that someone might. That some young assassin, eager to make a name, was given your description and told to find the ghost who once changed history. So you changed your name again, moved to a quiet village, limped a little, sold herbs, pretended you used to be a guard. But you didn't sleep well. You avoided crowds, sat near the door, kept your dagger under a floorboard beside the coin pouch that still smelled like the man you killed to earn it. You couldn't trust anyone, not even yourself. Years of silence and blood warped your thoughts. Every knock made you flinch. Every stranger was a threat. You forgot how to dream. Dreaming was dangerous. You couldn't love, couldn't relax, couldn't laugh too loud. You lived like a shadow. A tool, a path to power, and maybe even a divine partner. But Philip, he saw a beautiful enigma, a priestess cloaked in serpents and omens, useful for uniting tribes but dangerous in ways he couldn't quite name. Their union was marked by rituals and symbols, not romance. And behind every smile was strategy. Olympias wasn't content to be just another wife. While Philip expanded his empire, she focused on something far more personal, securing her son's place in history. From the moment Alexander was born, she wove around him a mythos, claiming he was not the son of Philip, but of Zeus himself. Whether she believed it or just needed others to believe it didn't matter. The point was power, and myth was her weapon. Her position at court became increasingly tense. Macedon wasn't a peaceful kingdom. It was a battlefield of ambitions, filled with scheming nobles, jealous wives, and half-brothers with competing claims. And Olympias, never one to play nice, made enemies fast. She didn't sit quietly. She fought, whispered, plotted. Her influence over Alexander was fierce and unwavering. To her, he wasn't just a king in the making. He was the chosen one. When Philip took a new, younger wife, tensions exploded. Olympias was exiled. But exile didn't break her. It sharpened her. She bided her time, waited for cracks in the throne, and then, in 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated. Who did it? No one knows for sure, but many eyes turned to Olympias. She returned not as a grieving widow, but as the mother of the new king. Alexander ascended, and Olympias was right beside him, not just as his mother, but as his fiercest ally, protector, and sometimes puppet master. While Alexander marched across the world, conquering cities and empires, Olympias ruled at home, manipulating politics, eliminating rivals, and making sure her son's legacy was untouchable. Even after Alexander's death, she didn't surrender. As rival factions tore the empire apart, Olympias fought to keep his bloodline alive. She raised armies, led campaigns, and executed enemies, all in the name of a son who was now a god in memory. Eventually, her enemies caught up. She was captured, refused mercy, and was executed by soldiers too afraid to kill her themselves, so they handed her over to the families of those she'd slain. They stoned her to death. But Olympias didn't die quietly. Her story lingered, like incense in a temple, thick and strange. Some called her a witch, others a queen. Some said she was touched by gods, but all remembered her as a woman who refused to be forgotten. Launched his legendary campaign against Persia, Olympias remained in Macedon, not as a passive spectator, but as its shadow ruler. She maintained correspondence, sent advice, and ensured the home front stayed loyal while her son carved his name into the world. Even as Alexander conquered cities, dethroned kings, and became a living god in foreign lands, it was his mother who kept his kingdom from unraveling behind him. Olympias understood the power of image and myth. Just as she had wrapped Alexander in divine omens from birth, she now helped preserve the illusion of his invincibility. Any rumor that questioned his lineage, any rival that hinted at weakness, she crushed. She wasn't just the mother of a king, she was the keeper of his legend. But power has a price. When Alexander died unexpectedly in Babylon in 323 BCE, the world he'd conquered was thrown into chaos. With no clear successor and his empire stretched thin, civil war loomed. Olympia saw her chance and her duty. Her grandson, Alexander IV, born to Alexander the Great and his Persian wife Roxana, was the legitimate heir. But the boy was a child, vulnerable, alone. So Olympias returned to the arena. She re-entered Macedonian politics not as a grieving grandmother, but as a queen with unfinished business. She formed alliances, raised armies, and marched to defend her bloodline. And for a moment, she succeeded. She took back the kingdom, had political enemies executed, even had a rival regent, Cassander's brother-in-law, stoned to death by her own soldiers. But she had overreached. Cassander, one of Alexander's former generals, regrouped. He laid siege to Olympias' city. Eventually, with promises of mercy, he coaxed the defenders into surrendering her. She was captured. Cassander, wary of executing the mother of Alexander the Great himself, refused to order her death directly. Instead, he let the families of those she had killed decide. They didn't hesitate. Olympias was executed by mob justice, stoned by those who had waited years for revenge. Her body was denied burial until later, when even Cassander, perhaps moved by guilt or political strategy, eventually allowed her to be laid to rest alongside Philip and Alexander. Olympias lived in a world of knives and shadows, and she wielded both with terrifying precision. She was a mother, a queen, a priestess, and a political force who reshaped the ancient world, not with armies, but with ambition and sheer will. Her name, once whispered with fear and awe, is now etched into the blood-stained marble of history, not as a victim, but as a power in her own right. A boy, barely old enough to speak his father's name, let alone defend his legacy. Born to Roxana, Alexander's Persian wife, the child was half Macedonian, half Persian, and fully a target. Olympias understood what that meant. The boy wasn't a ruler. He was a symbol, a banner for every faction to either rally behind or destroy, and she, Olympias, would make sure he lived long enough to wear the crown, even if it meant starting another war. She brought Roxana and the child under her protection, not out of love, but out of duty. Roxana had never been an ally, but her womb had secured the empire's last legitimate heir. That made her useful, for now. Antipater, still ruling in Macedon, knew Olympias was dangerous. Before his death, he bypassed her entirely, naming a different regent, Polyperchon, to take control. It was a move that enraged Cassander, Antipater's own son. Cassander was ambitious, cunning, and every bit his father's heir in ruthlessness. Olympias saw in him another Philip, a usurper, a threat. The stage was set. As tensions rose, Olympias allied herself with Polyperchon, promising her influence in exchange for protection of Alexander Fort's claim. She marched from Epirus back into Macedon, not as a grieving grandmother, but as a war queen. She rallied troops, stirred loyalties, called upon old allies from the days of Philip and Alexander, and for a time, she was victorious. Cassander's brother-in-law, Philip Aradus, the puppet king, was captured, and Olympias, in a chilling display of power, had both him and his wife Eurydice executed. But victory made her vulnerable. By 317 BCE, Cassander returned with an army. He laid siege to Olympias' stronghold at Pydna. She held out for months, hoping for relief, for a miracle, for divine intervention. None came. Her troops starved, her allies abandoned her. Eventually, the city surrendered. Cassander, ever the politician, offered her life in exchange for renouncing her claims. She refused. She demanded her royal rights, her place as queen mother, her grandson's protection. She reminded him who she was, the woman who bore Alexander the Great. But Macedon had moved on. Cassander handed her over to the families of those she had executed. They didn't hesitate. Olympias, queen, mother, priestess, warrior, was stoned to death by the mob. No trial. No ceremony. Just stones, rage, and silence. Her grandson, Alexander IV, lived a few more years under Cassander's watch. Eventually, he too was quietly executed, erased from the board like a piece in a long game of kings and ghosts. And so Olympias vanished, like so many women of power in ancient history, not forgotten, but distorted. To some, she was a witch queen, a poisoner, a manipulator. To others, a mother lion, fierce in her devotion, unbending in a world of traitors and swords. But one thing is certain, she shaped the fate of empires, not with an army, not with a throne, but with prophecy, vengeance, and fire in her blood. Feared woman in the ancient world stood surrounded, betrayed by time, by fortune, and by those who had once sworn loyalty to the name of Alexander. Her fortress at Pydna, once a beacon of resistance, was now a cage. Supplies dwindled, allies vanished. Her troops, starved and desperate, eventually surrendered in hopes of mercy. But mercy was not part of Cassander's vocabulary. Still, even then, even as defeat choked the walls around her, Olympias remained defiant. Cassander offered her a choice: surrender and face trial, or renounce her claims and live in quiet exile. She refused both. She would not grovel before the man she considered a usurper and a traitor to her son's legacy. Cassander handed her fate to the families of those she had executed. What followed was not a royal execution. It was mob justice. The mothers, the widows, the kin of her victims were led into her cell. No soldiers, no trial, no judge. Just a room, stones, and the chance to take revenge. Some sources say she faced them silently. Others say she spoke until the end, reminding them of what she'd done and why. But when the stones flew and the blood spilled, the Queen of Macedon, mother of the greatest conqueror the world had ever known, died as she had lived, surrounded by enemies, unbent and unafraid. Her body was left unburied. Her name was whispered with caution. And the child she fought to protect, Alexander IV, would be quietly murdered a few years later, his name erased from the line of kings. Olympias was gone, but her legend remained. Not the tidy version found in marble statues or royal scrolls, but the raw, brutal, and undeniable story of a woman who dared to claim a throne, bend fate to her will, and wage war in a world built to silence her. She was no saint. She was a storm. On the sun-baked island of Crete, just south of the modern city of Heraklion, there lies a ruin that feels more like a fever dream than a place built by hands. Its stone corridors twist and wind with no clear direction. Rooms fold in on themselves. Passages lead to dead ends or loop back unexpectedly. The air is heavy, thick with salt and the scent of old stone. Time doesn't feel real there. Minutes stretch, shadows move wrong, and the silence hums like something alive. Locals call it cursed. They say compasses don't work near it, that birds don't fly over it, and that those who wander too deep into its halls sometimes don't come out, or worse, they come back changed. According to scraps of ancient texts and half-whispered legends, it wasn't a palace nor a tomb, but something stranger, a sanctuary for a forgotten cult, a place where masks were worn not to hide, but to become, where people went not to worship gods, but to become vessels for them. There are symbols carved deep into the walls, older than Greek, older than logic. Some spiral endlessly. Others resemble serpents coiled in impossible knots. All of them seem to watch you if you stare too long. One chamber, larger than the rest, has a stone basin at its center. It's cracked, worn smooth by time, but still holds water, rainwater supposedly. But it never seems to dry. Visitors say if you look into it at the right angle, you won't see your reflection. You'll see something else, something staring back. No one knows who built it. No one knows why it was abandoned. But even now, the islanders avoid it. Fishermen bless themselves when they sail near. Children dare each other to touch its outer stones and then run away screaming. It is not on maps. It has no plaques or tour guides. It exists only in silence and stories, an echo of something too old and too strange to understand. And sometimes, when the wind is right, you can hear something from inside. Not voices, not footsteps, just movement. As if the stone itself remembers. Staircases that go nowhere. Corridors that twist and turn until you lose all sense of direction, even now. This is Knossos, the beating heart of the Minoan civilization, and the possible birthplace of one of humanity's oldest and most famous myths, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. But before the myth, there was a palace, unlike any other. Built around 1900 BCE and expanded over generations, Knossos wasn't just a royal residence, it was practically a city within a building. Spanning roughly 150,000 square feet, it held over 1,000 rooms, light wells, shrines, storerooms, workshops, even what might have been history's first flushing toilets. With running water, multi-level structures, and air circulation systems, this wasn't a primitive stronghold, it was an architectural wonder. To modern archaeologists, Knossos looks like intricate chaos. To ancient eyes, it must have felt like magic. The man who brought Knossos back into modern view was British archaeologist Arthur Evans. In the early 1900s, he excavated the site and became convinced this was the source of the Greek myth of the labyrinth. The structure was disorienting. The symbols, especially bulls, were everywhere, painted, carved, or molded into jewelry. Since bulls were sacred to the Minoans, Evans even named the civilization after the mythical King Minos. Whether King Minos existed or not, his legend and the ruins became inseparable. But here's the twist. No actual labyrinth has ever been found. No underground maze. No monstrous prisoner. Instead, what we have is a palace built in such a complex, winding way that it seems meant to confuse. The deeper you explore, the harder it is to tell where fact ends and myth begins. So maybe the Minotaur wasn't born in these halls. Maybe the palace itself was the monster. Knossos never gives easy answers, but it's excellent at making us ask better questions. The myth itself is famous, a monstrous half-man, half-bull trapped in a maze so complex no one could escape. Only Theseus, the Athenian hero, defeated the beast. and only with help from Princess Ariadne and her thread to trace the path back. But why a labyrinth, and why a minotaur? The earliest versions of the myth speak of King Minos, ruler of Crete, who demanded Athens send 7 boys and 7 girls each year as tribute, victims for the minotaur, a creature born of divine shame and punishment. Trapped in a maze, the minotaur represented something ugly and hidden behind power and beauty. To the ancient Greeks, Crete was mysterious and powerful. Its people, the Minoans, were rich, artistic, and strange. Their rituals included bull leaping. Their gods looked foreign. Their palaces, like Knossos, were unlike anything on the mainland. To a Greek from 1000 BCE, Knossos would have felt like stepping into another world. The bull was sacred. Frescoes show youths leaping over bulls in ritual. Horns, called horns of consecration, sat atop buildings and altars. Now combine all that with a building so complex it could confuse anyone, and you start to see where the legend came from. But what if the Minotaur wasn't a literal monster? What if it was a symbol? Some historians think the myth reflects a time when Crete really did dominate Athens, when tribute was real. The labyrinth could represent political entrapment, and the Minotaur, the terrifying power behind it all. Others suggest it's about the mind. The labyrinth is the subconscious, the Minotaur are hidden fears, and Theseus the brave ego walking into the dark, clinging to memory. Regardless, the ruins of Knossos remain the closest thing we found to a real-life labyrinth. There's no Ariadne, no Minotaur, just history so strange it demands a myth to explain it. Before Athens built marble temples or Sparta raised its spears, there was the Minoan civilization, one of Europe's earliest great powers. They didn't rule with armies. They ruled through trade, through beauty, and through a near magical command of building design. At the heart of it all stood Knossos, not just a palace, but a cultural and economic nerve center. From about 2600 to 1400 BCE, the Minoans flourished. Based on Crete, they built a vast trade network that stretched to Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the coasts of Spain. Their ships cut across the Mediterranean, carrying saffron, fine pottery, bronze, and exotic goods. They didn't conquer, they connected, and that's what made them powerful. What makes Minoan culture stand out the most is how different it was from the Greeks who came after. Their art didn't glorify war, it celebrated nature and life. Their art celebrated animals and fluid human motion, never war or divine wrath. Frescoes showed dancers, dolphins, and athletes leaping over bulls in graceful displays. Even their goddesses were different. Powerful, bare-chested figures holding snakes, symbols of fertility, transformation, and protection. At the heart of it all was Knossos, not perched defensively on a hilltop like other ancient centers, but resting confidently in a fertile valley. It had no massive protective walls, suggesting the Minoans either felt safe on their island or projected enough strength to deter threats altogether. Their boldness was reflected in their architecture. Multi-story buildings, columned courtyards, and complex plumbing systems all pointed to a society well ahead of its time. Yet for all their achievements, the Minoans left behind no decipherable texts. Their primary script, Linear A, remains unreadable. We don't know their name for themselves, what their rulers believed, the prayers they offered, or what truly went on within the halls of Knossos. All that survives are their ruins, their vivid art, and their cultural influence, which was absorbed by the Mycenaeans and echoed in Greek mythology. The Minoans weren't just architects of palaces, they were builders of enigmas. And Knossos was more than a structure. It was the living pulse of a civilization that flickered like sunlight on the Aegean before disappearing. Some say that echo still lingers in the ruins. Walking through Knossos is like walking through layered time, confusing, beautiful, and immersive. It's not the sheer size that strikes you most, it's the layout. Rooms lead to rooms, corridors split off unpredictably, light wells pierce the center of the structure, staircases vanish into darkness or rise into open-air courtyards. Nothing follows a straight line. It's easy to understand why ancient travelers might have called it a labyrinth. Knossos wasn't just a royal complex, it was a living organism. Covering about 150,000 square feet, the structure had over 1,000 rooms, each with specific purposes: storage, workshops, apartments, shrines, even throne rooms. All of it was arranged around a central courtyard that likely hosted rituals or ceremonial events like bull leaping. Built across natural slopes and terraces, the palace rose 4 or 5 stories in some areas. To navigate it required memory, instinct, or perhaps a guiding thread, like in the myth of Theseus. Yet beneath all this apparent chaos was sophisticated engineering. The Minoans used passive ventilation, channeling air through shafts and staircases to cool the rooms. Rainwater flowed through clay pipes, and they even had toilets that flushed, centuries before Rome made such plumbing famous. One of the most iconic spots is the so-called throne room, featuring an alabaster seat carved into the wall, flanked by benches. Surrounding frescoes depict griffins, mythical guardians. Was this a king's seat? A goddess's sanctuary? A courtroom? No one really knows. And the walls? They spoke in vibrant color. Dolphins swam above bathtubs. Women in layered skirts danced with bare chests. Youths leapt bulls mid-flight. This wasn't just art, it was cultural identity. Natural, graceful, and deeply tied to the earth and sea. But the deeper you go, the more disorienting it becomes. Some areas seem designed to confuse. Perhaps that's the root of the labyrinth legend. Not a prison for monsters, but a palace that felt alive, a sacred maze meant to awe and unsettle. There were no iron gates, no half-human beasts, just a place meant to make you question where you were and what waited behind the next turn. Knossos wasn't just where royalty lived, it was where the divine was honored. The palace itself functioned as a temple. Unlike later Greek shrines to Zeus or Athena, Minoan spirituality was built into the bones of the structure. Altars, horn-shaped symbols, and hidden shrines appeared throughout. Sacred pillars stood like sentinels. Bull motifs dominated, revealing a deep, symbolic relationship between nature, worship, and this revered animal. They didn't fear bulls, they revered them. The famous bull-leaping fresco wasn't sport, it may have been sacred drama. Young men and women locked in a choreographed display of daring and grace, perhaps a religious rite or a symbolic victory over chaos. Then there were the snake goddess statues, found deep within palace storerooms. Bare-breasted, arms raised, snakes coiled around them. These were not timid idols. They were powerful, protective, and symbolic of rebirth, fertility, and mystery. Snakes in Minoan thought were not evil. They were sacred. These figurines were likely used in household rituals, placed in quiet, sacred corners of the palace. Combined with the art, horns, and maze-like layout, the entire palace begins to feel like a ritual engine, a structure not just for living, but for connecting with something higher. There was no need for a separate temple. The palace was a temple. Every wall, stair, and courtyard was part of a spiritual worldview where the sacred and everyday were one and the same. Knossos wasn't just a shelter, it was a conduit to the divine. For centuries, the palace thrived, center of power, culture, and innovation. Then something shifted, something no one fully understands. By around 1400 BCE, Knossos was abandoned. Its frescoes faded. The Minoan civilization that once commanded the sea vanished. What happened? Theories abound. Some blame nature. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, erupted with unimaginable force. The resulting tsunamis likely battered Crete's shores, wrecking ports and farmland. Ash could have blackened the skies, killing crops and collapsing the economy. While Knossos wasn't immediately destroyed, the long-term consequences may have been devastating, economically, politically, and spiritually. Others blame war. By 1450 BCE, the Mycenaeans, mainland Greeks, were rising. Archaeological evidence suggests they briefly occupied Knossos, but the culture changed. The art became more martial. Linear A was replaced by Linear B, the writing of Mycenaean scribes. The palace that once sang with bull leapers and goddesses now whispered in a foreign tongue. Some scholars think the Mycenaeans didn't conquer all at once, but gradually absorbed Crete, first through trade, then political control, and finally occupation. Others suggest internal collapse, rebellion, corruption, or a breakdown in leadership. What's striking is how quietly Knossos fell. No signs of mass destruction, no skeletons trapped under rubble, just silence. The palace simply stopped. Its rituals ended. Nature crept back. By the time Homer wrote about Crete in his epics, Knossos was already legend. A story wrapped in monsters, kings, and impossible mazes. And maybe that's fitting, because what ended Knossos wasn't just eruption, invasion, or decay, it was time. and the way even the brightest civilizations eventually vanish under the weight of history. But the bones are still there, and if you listen closely, the maze still whispers beneath the soil. Once forgotten and buried beneath time, Knossos had become little more than a crumbling mound, swallowed by olive groves and dust. Its name faded, its myths warped. That is, until one man decided to follow a legend. Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist with a flair for drama and a passion for Homeric myth, arrived in 1900. Farmers in the area had been unearthing mysterious seals and artifacts, hints of something ancient lying below. Evans bought the land and began digging, and what he uncovered would reshape Aegean history. He discovered a vast, complex, and highly sophisticated palace, so remarkable in its layout and imagery that Evans became convinced it was the mythical home of King Minos. The elaborate frescoes, the recurring bull motifs, the strange architecture, it all seemed to him like proof of the legendary labyrinth. But Evans wasn't just excavating, he was shaping a story. He named the unknown civilization Minoan after Minos, interpreted religious symbols, reconstructed frescoes, and controversially rebuilt parts of the palace using Edwardian concrete. Today, what visitors see at Knossos is part ancient ruin, part modern imagination. Some praise Evans' vision, others accuse him of altering the past. Regardless, he did what no one else dared. He gave Knossos a voice. He brought to light a Bronze Age world older than classical Greece, one filled with art, ritual, and maritime grace. He also uncovered the enigmatic Linear A script, still undeciphered, opening new questions about language and memory in the ancient world. Evans didn't just dig up stones, he revived a legend. He forced scholars to confront a truth. Behind the myth of the labyrinth stood something real, something hauntingly human. A palace that felt alive, a civilization that faded into shadow, and a rediscovery that revealed a story stranger and more enchanting than fiction. For 3,000 years, Knossos had slept. Evans was the one who rang the bell. Walking through Knossos today is like stepping into a visual language. Frescoes, carvings, and repeating patterns decorate every surface. But there's no written translation. The Minoans left no decipherable records. Without a Rosetta Stone, we can't read their thoughts, only glimpse them through brushstrokes and symbols. The art of Knossos is unique in the ancient world. It doesn't glorify war or show rows of kings. Instead, it celebrates the rhythms of nature, dolphins in motion, blooming lilies, birds in flight, and sacred bulls. The people in the art are fluid, elegant, dancing, or engaged in ritual. Even when danger appears, it's wrapped in grace. The Minoans seemed more concerned with beauty and cosmic harmony than with conquest. Central to their symbolism was the double axe, or labrys. Found in shrines and carvings across the site, it may have represented a goddess or celestial power. Some scholars even believe the word labyrinth comes from labrys, making the fabled maze not a trap but a sacred space, the house of the double axe. The horns of consecration, stylized bull horns adorning rooftops and altars, reinforced the site's spiritual nature. Together with constant bull imagery and ceremonial bull leaping, it's clear the bull was a sacred icon, possibly linked to fertility, chaos, or divinity. Even the structure of Knossos might hold symbolic meaning. Its complex design, with winding hallways and layered rooms, may mirror spiritual beliefs, seasonal cycles, or journeys through life and death. Some archaeologists believe the palace wasn't just designed for living, but for invoking transformation. It may not have been a maze to trap a beast, but a symbolic path of initiation. Yet without a deciphered language, all interpretations teeter between insight and imagination. The Minoans didn't speak through epics, they spoke through visuals. What does Knossos mean? We can feel the rhythm, we can see the beauty, but the deeper meaning stays just out of reach, like a story half remembered. The palace is a ruin, but it doesn't feel lifeless. Step through its halls and you'll feel something humming beneath the surface. Not ghosts or gods, but echoes. Knossos continues to captivate, thousands of years after it fell. We don't know the names of Minoan rulers. We don't know their prayers or laws, but we know they honored beauty. We know they revered the natural world. We know they created a society that balanced architecture with art, ritual with daily life, and we know they were among the first. Before the Parthenon, before Roman forums, before the Hebrew temples or Persian palaces, there was Knossos. It was a palace that was also a city, a city that was also a temple, and perhaps a temple that was also a story. Maybe the labyrinth isn't a puzzle at all. Maybe it's a myth carved into walls, a narrative told in columns and corridors. The Greeks turned it into a legend. We turned it into archaeology. But at its core, Knossos has always been both. Even now, we can map the site, photograph it, and recreate its frescoes. But the mystery doesn't fade. The boundary between truth and ancient stone. Perhaps that's why Knossos endures, not because it gives us answers, but because it asks questions. It's a place that reminds us not all history is meant to be solved. Some is meant to be felt. Knossos, ancient have remembered, is more than just a ruin. It's a question, a riddle wrapped in walls. And like Theseus, we're all still following the thread. Meanwhile, ancient engineers across the Mediterranean busy turning brute force and strategy. The early battering rams were simple. Teams of soldiers lifting a tree trunk and slamming it in enemy gates by lumberjacks. But over time, the ram became more than a tool. It became a weapon of terror. Assyrian engineers refined the design. They mounted rams in wheel frames and added roofs to protect crews from arrows and boiling oil. Their siege towers sometimes find rams with platforms or archers. So while a gate being pounded into splinters, defenders were also being peppered with arrows. Reliefs from Nineveh showed these war machines rolling towards city walls. Massive iron beams that moved like slow, relentless gods of destruction. Rams weren't just used gates. They targeted weak points in walls, smashed watchtowers, and collapsed fortifications entirely. Their presence sent a clear message: surrender or reduce to rubble. The Greeks refined the technology further. Then the Romans perfected it. Roman engineers built massive siege shelters called Ares, Latin ram. Suspended inside chains or ropes, the beams swing like a pendulum, hammering stone with the rhythm of thunder. Some required dozens of soldiers to operate. Their movements synchronized to keep rams swinging in harmony. It was organized destruction, devastating vision. Even mighty siege engines needed protection. Battering rams, despite their power, were vulnerable. If they stalled under enemy fire, missiles, stones, or burning oil, they became city targets. But once they gained momentum, they were nearly unstoppable. Wood versus stone, muscle versus masonry, pure fist turned into war. And that was just the beginning of humanity's obsession, cracking open fortified walls. If battering rams with muscle, catapults with brains. It distance, launching not just rocks, but fear. These early artillery systems changed siege warfare by weaponizing force in ways that seemed almost magical. The first torsion-powered catapults were developed in the 4th century BCE by Greek engineers, particularly under Dionysius I of Syracuse, who sought an edge in siege warfare. Instead of muscle, these machines used twisted ropes of sinew or hair to store massive amounts of energy. When released, they could launch projectiles, stones, spears, flaming jars, hundreds of meters with terrifying speed and force. Two main types of catapults emerged: the ballista, a giant crossbow that fired massive bolts, and the stone thrower, which lobbed boulders over fortifications. The Romans, as always, took Greek ingenuity and militarized it even further. Their catapults were modular, mobile, and deadly. Some could hurl 60-pound stones at high velocity, smashing through gates or scattering enemy troops. But it wasn't just about smashing walls. These machines waged psychological war. Generals sometimes flung diseased bodies, severed heads, or burning pitch into cities to spread panic, disease, and despair. Then came the trebuchet, the crown jewel of medieval siegecraft. Towering, creaking, and apocalyptic, it was more than a weapon, it was a declaration. Unlike torsion weapons, trebuchets used gravity, a counterweight on one end of a long arm, a sling on the other. When the weight dropped, the arm whipped forward, flinging the payload in a deadly arc. The earliest versions used human power and appeared in China as early as the 4th century BCE, but the counterweight trebuchet exploded onto the European battlefield by the 12th century, likely through Muslim or Byzantine channels. Once adopted in Europe, the trebuchet became a symbol of unstoppable force. Well-built versions could hurl 300-pound stones over 300 meters, smashing towers, shattering morale, and even lobbing fire, lime, dead animals, or insults into city centers. At the siege of Stirling Castle, one machine, nicknamed Warwolf, was so massive the defenders surrendered before it even fired. The king refused their surrender just so he could use it anyway. But while trebuchets ruled the skies, siege towers brought the war to your doorstep. Imagine a multi-story wooden tower on wheels, clad in wet hides to resist fire, bristling with archers and spearmen. These mobile fortresses rolled up to enemy walls, allowing attackers to storm the battlements directly. The Assyrians may have pioneered them, but the Greeks and Macedonians took them to new heights, literally. At the siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE, Demetrius built a 9-story monster called the Helepolis. It was so big it collapsed under its own weight, but the ambition was clear. Rise above the wall, take the fight to the top. Defenders weren't idle. They flooded moats, dug trenches, and still, when a siege tower connected with a wall, it meant one thing: hand-to-hand chaos. It wasn't just a breach, it was an invasion. But not all attacks came from above. Some crept in from below. Tunneling, also known as sapping, was siege warfare's silent killer. Dig under the enemy wall, prop the tunnel with wood, then burn the supports. When the timbers collapsed, so did the wall. Ancient armies used it for centuries, from the Assyrians to the Spartans to medieval engineers. At Rochester Castle in 1212, King John's troops used pig fat to fuel a mine under a tower, reducing it to rubble. It was crude, slow, and terrifyingly effective. Sometimes defenders heard the scraping of enemy shovels. That's when they dug countermines, leading to underground knife fights in absolute darkness. Claustrophobic, dirty, and brutal, this was siege warfare at its most intimate. Meanwhile, defenders above ground got creative. Greek fire, a terrifying Byzantine invention, was a napalm-like liquid that kept burning even on water. Sprayed from siphons or thrown in clay, turned ships and men into infernos. Its formula remains a secret lost to time. For more low-tech options, and boiling liquids were always on the menu. Boiling oil or sand poured through murder holes could turn armored soldiers into screaming wrecks. Hot sand in particular seeped into armor joints, cooking the skin underneath. And gravity? It never failed. Rocks, logs, even dead animals were dropped from above. Castles were riddled with traps, spikes, collapsing bridges, all designed to stall and confuse attackers. The goal wasn't just to kill, it was to hold the line until the attackers broke, supplies ran dry, or reinforcements arrived. Ultimately, siege warfare wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Siege engines were propaganda. They announced doom. The Assyrians paraded theirs across the desert. Romans built theirs in full view of the enemy. Trebuchets weren't just weapons, they were thunderous threats that loomed like omens. Payloads carried messages, sometimes literal. Heads of envoys, diseased corpses, or even blood-soaked warnings were flung over walls to erode morale. At the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, plague-ridden corpses were catapulted into the city, possibly helping spark the Black Death in Europe. Even the sound of siege was part of the terror. The rhythm of a battering ram, the eerie silence before a trebuchet launched, the creak of ropes winding, these became the soundtrack of fear. Commanders knew that sometimes a fortress didn't fall to force. It crumbled from within. If the mine broke before the stone did, victory was only a matter of time. Eventually, siege engines gave way to gunpowder. Cannons reduced castle walls to dust in minutes. By the 15th century, the thunder of artillery replaced the creak of wooden giants, but their legacy endures. Modern missile systems, howitzers, and even cyber warfare echo ancient siege logic. Break the barrier, shake the will, and take the prize. And though the battering rams and trebuchets are now relics, siege warfare is still alive. Only the walls have changed. Now they're digital, economic, or psychological. But someone is still trying to break in, and someone else is still trying to keep them out. The siege continues,